How you doing? Now today's video series will be on Amy Whitting's novel I for Isabel, which if you're in year 12 is one of the text response choices you have for your end of year exam. Now unlike previous videos, there is quite a lot of analysis in this series, particularly chapter 4, which is why this series is so long for a relatively short novel. Now there's obviously tons more that you can analyze, but I've just included some of the parts that I found to be particularly interesting. Now we're going to jump straight into this, starting from chapter 1, the birthday present. Now, in preparation for her 9th birthday, Isobel Callahan laments about her desolate past birthdays and how those birthdays are never something to be celebrated, but something that she always associates with resentment and disappointment. Now, this is due primarily to her mother saying, "No birthday presents this year," even though every year at this time she said this. Now, while Isabel's mother, May, attributes this lack of presents to the necessity of being very careful about money, this is juxtaposed immediately by the fact that they are at a Mrs. Terry's lakeside boarding house where they spent the summer holidays. So she can afford to have a summer holiday, but she can't afford to buy her own daughter a present. Seems legit. Now, it's also noteworthy that Isabel's older sister, Margaret, does not seem to endure this same kind of treatment. Now, anyway, this means that there is an immediate sense of familial tension between Isobel and her mother. Despite how warranted it may or may not be, there is a level of neglect there. Full disclosure, we never fully discover why this is the case. Now, resigned to the neglect that she receives every year on her birthday, Isobel instead seeks solace in her reading. And at this time, she is reading none other than The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Now, she also notes that when reading, birthdays, injustices, parents all vanished. So for her, reading is very much an avenue of escapism. Now, Isobel awakes early the next day on her birthday to tell the tree it's her birthday, but she encounters Caroline Mansell, a neighboring child, whom she tells instead. Now, later on, at breakfast, Isobel's family sits with several neighbors, during which time those neighbors, particularly Miss Halwood, who is a teacher, praise Isobel for her reading ability, which makes Isobel start to feel drunk on approval. Now, later on, Isobel is tasked by her mother with picking up a writing pad at a local store, and she is allowed to keep the change since it is her birthday. Now, when she buys the pad, she realizes that she barely has enough to pay for it. So even though she gets to keep the change, it's not enough to buy something that could be called a birthday present. Now, this causes Isobel to descend into a fit of depression, during which time she struggles not to cry. Now, when she returns home, it is lunchtime, and Isobel goes to the dining room where there is a present waiting for her from Mr. Mansell, which is Caroline's father. Now, presumably, he found out it was Isobel's birthday from Caroline, whom Isobel told in confidence. Now, the present is a gold brooch, which Isobel describes as beautiful. It was a present for a real girl. Now, true to form, May, Isobel's mother, she says that Mr. Mansell shouldn't have bought the present because apparently Isobel is spoilt enough already. But this earns her nothing but a shared glare of indignation from the other adults around the table, all except Mr. Mansell, who is still regarding Isobel with a bright, soft look. Now, after inhaling her lunch, Isobel takes her present and hurries to her room to read, incrementally stealing glances at the gold brooch as well. Now, Mrs. Callahan comes in shortly after, and Isobel realizes that she had been told not to tell anyone of her birthday, and she did, so she knows that retribution was coming. May Callahan slaps Isobel several times, though it's stated that there was not much to cry about, for her mother's intentions were far more violent than her blows. Her hands flapped weakly, as if she was fighting against a cage of air. Now, May also degrades Isobel by calling her ungrateful little bitch and thankless little swine for not saying thank you for Mr. Mansell. Doesn't everyone say that to their kids? Now, anyway, even though May continues to scold Isobel, she ultimately says that words are wasted on you. Now, interestingly, it's not specified where May slaps Isobel. However, after May leaves, Isobel rubbed her stinging legs. So that's probably where she was being slapped. Now, a lot of you, I think, would imagine her being slapped in the face, but I don't think it was as savage as that. So check your imaginations, guys. Stop picturing child abuse. Anyway, Isobel pins the brooch to her dress, and then she looks at herself in the mirror. She wonders why May didn't take it, and even flirts with the idea that there were things her mother couldn't do. Now, she watches herself in the mirror wearing the brooch and admiring it, and it's stated that in one way or another, she would be wearing it all her life. Think about what that symbolizes. Now, chapter 2, False Idols and a Fireball. Now, this chapter begins with an explanation of a time when Isobel allegedly saw a fireball streaking across the sky during a rainstorm, and obviously, due to how unlikely and ridiculous this was, the fireball became a symbol or another word for lie, as well as a well-known joke. Now, it is henceforth stated that it was well established that Isobel was a liar because of this particular anecdote. Now, this prompts Isobel to ponder about the nature of truth and falsehood. She explains to her mother that after forgetting a workbook, Sister Ignatius, who is one of Isobel's teachers, she makes the observation that Isobel seems to forget a lot of things, including her school money every second week. Now, while Isobel attributes this to the wild beast of poverty at home, she explains this exchange to May, but May does not believe her, which in turn even causes Isobel to doubt whether or not the exchange took place at all. The extent to which May doubts Isobel's honesty is such that even Isobel doubts her own honesty as well and accepts herself as a hopeless-born liar. Now, a noteworthy quote here is, "Suppose truth was a handful of sand that trickled through her fingers. Suppose something of the sort had happened. She had had the truth of it for a moment, but hadn't been able to carry it home." Now, what this tells us is that Isobel struggles not just with the nature of truth, but with the limitations and the inaccuracies of memory. She has been instilled with such a deep measure of self-doubt from her mother that she is reluctant to even trust her own judgment. And this is important because it highlights that fragmentation of identity that Isobel endures throughout the course of the novel. She has been conditioned not to trust herself, to think of herself as a liar, and so the security that she has in her identity and in the notion of truth, that is severed. She doesn't have a strong relationship with herself. Now, shortly after this, Isobel slides into bed, and it is rightly stated that bed was Isobel's kingdom. So the symbolism there is pretty straightforward. It is here that she retreats into her private world. That is a fabricated world that she has invented in her imagination and seems to access only when she is in bed and under the covers. Now, this private world is inhabited by several fabricated characters by the name of Robert, Angela, and Gerald. Now, based on the story that Isobel imagines between these three characters, we're not given a lot of information. However, the gist of the story is that these three men are all actors. Now, Robert, in the story, he has just fled from two bodyguards that work for his father, while he was putting up posters for his play that night. Now, why these men are after Robert, we don't know, but because of this, Angelo, another actor, he suggests that Robert does not perform in the play that night, in case the men come looking for him. Now, Gerald disagrees. He thinks that being in makeup will make him unrecognizable. It's also important to note that Robert has a stammer, but it's also mentioned that Robert has never stammered while he's been on stage. At the end of the story, the group seems to imply that they would be better off not risking a performance. Now, a lot of you might read this section and wonder what relevance this has. If you think about it though, even if that's all we get from this story, you can still draw specific parallels between the characters of the story and Isobel herself. In the story, Robert, he is fleeing people that work for his father, and so obviously there is a relationship there, a parental relationship from which he is running. Now, presumably, Isobel is dreaming this up to parallel her own desire to flee from a tyrannical parent. Now, similarly, Robert suffers from a stammer in the story. However, he never stammers when he's on stage, when he's performing, so to speak. So in a sense, he is more himself when he's pretending to be someone else, like a character in a play. Now, this links to Isobel because in the presence of her mother, she feels that she has no voice or that her words mean nothing because her mother thinks that she is a liar. However, when Isobel is reading, when she's finding that escapism in reading, similar to the way Robert does, or all actors do in their performing, that stammer, that voicelessness, and that powerlessness, that's not there anymore. It goes away. And so this highlights how in the face of that powerlessness, one can find power in escapism. And for Isobel, that escapism is books. Now, this is something that Isobel is aware of, and as such, she is quick to criticize it. She says of the characters that she is imagining that it was all lies. But at the same time, she is not willing to give up those lies, those pieces of fiction, because for her, they represent moments in which she can find power. And it is rightly stated, there was no living without the moments. Now, Isobel returns to her story, this time following a character called Antonia, who is the wife of Gerald, and she is just performed in a play. Now, she is praised by a famous producer who beckons her to perform in his own city, and that's about all that happens in the story. Now, after this, there are kind of snippets of scenes. One is Gerald drawing a sword on kidnappers while Robert is running away from them. Another snippet is of Antonia, Gerald, and Robert sitting around a campfire, and Robert is snuggling up with Gerald. Yes, Gerald is Antonia's husband, but he's snuggling up with Robert. So you can read into that, but it seems like it's arguably a bit kind of homosexual. Which, there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, but he's got a wife, so that's a bit weird. Now, shortly after this, Isobel remarks that these characters, these lies, they're not just ordinary lies, but they've become something more. She describes them as false idols, because not only are they lies, but she views this deception, specifically this self-deception, as a mortal sin. And as such, she needs to give them up, because apparently one mortal sin was enough to bring on eternal hellfire. Ain't nobody got time for that. Now, at the same time, though, she knows that she can't give them up because she needs them. And so instead, she decides that she will make up for it via a deathbed repentance. That's basically just feeling remorseful and regretful about it at the time of death, because apparently that's good enough. Now, this leads to Isobel thinking about her mother, May, who apparently asks Isobel over and over again if she loves her. Now, it becomes a pattern where May says, "Do you love me?" And Isobel says, "Yes." "Do you love me?" "Yes." "Do you love me?" "Yes." "Do you love me?" "Yes." "How much do you love me?" 1 whole shilling's worth? Now, May actually tells Isobel to say, "Mommy, I love you 1 whole shilling's worth." And she does, but at the same time, Isobel is confused, because if she's such a born liar in the eyes of her mother, then why is her mother putting so much stock in what Isobel says now? That bitch be desperate. What's more than that is that Isobel is obviously not the only character who is seeking solace in particular pieces of fiction, if you know what I mean. Now, Isobel is no longer sent to her local convent, but after a few days she is sent to a convent in the next suburb instead. Now, on a particular Sunday after Mass, Mrs. Callahan is approached by the parish priest, who engages in a private talk with her, which leaves her blushing with satisfied pride. Now, what the hell he says, we don't know. That's not specified, but it causes her to send Isobel back to her local convent. Now, Isobel is cool with it. In fact, she hopes to learn from Sister Ignatius how to become a knowing sinner. That is, to become more aware of the difference between truth and lies, because this is something that she is struggling to reconcile. She is struggling to reconcile between fantasies and reality, her pieces of fiction or her fireballs, and what's really happening around her. Ultimately, this doesn't come to anything, though. Now, on another day, Isobel and her mother and her sister all set off to visit their aunt, and Isobel is accused of stealing and then losing Margaret's gold chain bracelet. Now, Isobel wants to shriek in defense of this allegation, but ultimately restrains herself as she believes that it was important not to break the silence. Instead, she imagines herself wearing the bracelet in the street and having it fall off without her noticing, and she is unable to believe that this actually happened. Now, this is juxtaposed with another decision that Isobel makes, which is to actually believe that she did in fact see that fireball streaking across the sky. Whether or not that actually happened, she chooses to believe that and believe it adamantly. Now, the reason something like this is difficult is because if Isobel doesn't know what happened and what didn't happen, really, then what the hell chance do we have of knowing? It calls into question the reliability of everything that she says. And this is what Isobel wants to learn, to be able to tell that difference between truth and lies. Chapter 3, The Grace of God and the Hand-Me-Down. Now, during Mass, Isobel feels descended upon by the grace of God. Now, this is in response to a young visiting priest who gives a sermon about the sinful human soul, which he describes to be like a cracked, cobwebbed cell filled with scuttling insects that many people only half-heartedly attempt to drive out. The insects, of course, representing unseemly thoughts and desires. Now, he suggests that if one's soul were to be penetrated, yes, penetrated by the light of the Holy Spirit, I shouldn't make that joke, I'm a terrible human being! Anyway, if one was to allow the light of God into their spirit, then one would experience a glorious change. Now, these words have an effect on Isobel more magical than moral. Now, inspired, Isobel makes a pledge to herself to give up fighting with Margaret and to give up backchatting. Now, the parish priest then approaches Mrs. Callahan and commends both of the Callahan daughters, but more so Isobel for her impressive exam results. Now, it's not until they are walking home afterward that May mutters about what she should have said in response to the priest, which is that Isobel is a street angel, home devil. Now, this prompts Isobel to ponder the nature and the rewards of being good, which is that the harder it was, the better. You would know then that you deserved the light. Now, that night, Isobel sets the table for dinner and peels some vegetables, but Margaret says it was Isobel's turn to wash the dishes. Isobel perceives this as a test, and she admits that she forgot about the dishes, but she still is going to wash them. Oh my god, this is so juicy. Now, similarly, during dinner, May says that Isobel will have to visit their Auntie Anne on the grounds that it is too hot outside, and May doesn't want Margaret going, who was originally the one who was supposed to go anyway. Now, again, Isobel subdues herself, thinking that May is trying to antagonize her, and she succeeds in subduing herself because she realizes that she likes going to Auntie Anne's because there are books there. Now, this new self-composure, however, seems to irritate May. Now, as requested, Isobel goes to Auntie Anne's, apparently to deliver a meat press. Seriously, what kind of useless-ass errand is that? But anyway, while she's there, Isobel sits and she reads a book. And she also ponders how having grace means that she was never again going to be happier in one place than another. Because having grace meant having inner peace, regardless of time and place. Now, she returns home in time to set the table again for dinner, after which she attempts to clear the dishes away. Now, May refuses to let her do this, and she says it's Margaret's turn, and this elicits from Isobel a new temptation, which is not the rage of defeat, but the smirk of victory. Now, a few days later at dinner, May finally confronts Isobel about her apparent sulking. Isobel calmly denies this, but May keeps pressing and even calls her a nasty little beast, Miss Superior, and a brazen little liar. Now, in spite of this, Isobel remains calm, and when she looks at her mother, she realizes several things. Now, first, Isobel notes, I do something for her when I scream, because that's not depressing at all. And secondly, she realizes that May's anger is like a live animal tormenting her, and by refusing to give her that outlet for her anger, Isobel is, in essence, torturing her mother. Now, this makes Isobel think of her father, who used to do the same thing, until one night when he finally snapped and he came at May with a knife. Sweet baby Jesus, that's pretty dark. But Isobel also remembers that before her father, Rob, before he slashed May's hand with the knife, May's eyes had been like two little glittering points of satisfaction, as if she reveled in Rob's rage, or more specifically, her power to provoke him into a rage. Now, Isobel remembers this, and she notes that her own silence and composure is not for the purpose of torturing her mother. It wasn't about May or anyone else for that matter, it was about Isobel's own peace of mind. And in that way, she remarks that Grace was selfish. Now, finally, this causes May to retreat to her bedroom. Now, one day, Margaret returns home and reveals that she is in a play, which is Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, and that she will be required to stay back after school several days a week to rehearse. Now, May agrees so long as Margaret is at home at a reasonable hour. Now, over the next several days, Isobel struggles to retain her grace, if only because she becomes jealous of Margaret. And this is because the play involves real boys, and also the fact that the play is Shakespearean, because apparently Shakespeare belonged to Isobel. Now, in their beds, Margaret is going over her lines, and she asks Isobel not to tell their mother that the play involves boys, which surprises Isobel since Margaret is speaking to her like an actual human being, because yeah, desperation can do that to people. One night, Margaret returns, particularly late from rehearsal, which causes May to scold her. But Margaret says, chill out, you already agreed to this, if you had a problem with it, you shouldn't have agreed to it in the first place. Mic drop, May gets wrecked. This victory, though, is short-lived because the next rehearsal day, Margaret returns home to learn that May has discovered a hidden stash of makeup. Now, May accuses Margaret of chasing boys, and again, Margaret retaliates, claiming that May has no right to go through her stuff. This causes May to lament to herself, muttering about the thanklessness of being a parent and how children apparently are heartless and ungrateful. Now, also during this muttering, she describes herself as a widowed mother, probably to convince herself that she deserves sympathy. But the reason I bring this up is because it's the first most explicit mention that we get of Rob Callahan, Isabel's father. It's the first mention we get of him having passed away. We don't know when, we don't know how, we just know now that it's happened. Now, Isobel perceives the true suffering look of her mother and even laughs. However, she quickly realizes that taking joy in her mother's suffering would mean losing her grace, so she promptly composes herself again. Due to this minor outburst, Isobel begins to study saints by way of reading books from the public library in the hope of discovering how people in the past, mostly saints, were able to retain their grace. Now, the one message that she comes away with from her reading is to always give up sacrifice. It appears that sacrifice is the price of grace and saintliness. Now, Margaret's involvement in the play starts to lose its romanticized appeal since she seems to be struggling with the stress of it all. It gets cut back to an abridged version and it is no longer performed publicly, and Isobel is unable to tell whether or not Margaret is happy when it's all over. Now, another day, the Callahans are visited by their aunt Noeline, which is their father's sister. The girls are excited about this since apparently it means a bit of gift money and her cast-off clothes. Now, they all sit at the kitchen table and exchange pleasantries. Rob's funeral comes up, which incites an argument between May and Noeline. Now, apparently, May has a go at Noeline because they didn't visit Rob when he was in hospital. And Noeline says that she and her sister, Yvonne, didn't know the full extent of Rob's condition. Full disclosure, we got no idea either, and illness is never specified. Now, May says that they didn't want to know, basically because they suck. But Noeline says, bitch, you ain't no angel either. Aunt Noeline then leaves some money for the girls, and then she takes off. Now, the girls then open up the parcel of clothes that Noeline brought for them. They find a buttercup yellow dress, which Margaret obviously loves, but it has Isobel's name on it. Now, Isobel remembers what she learned about grace, which is to always give up and sacrifice. So she tells Margaret that she can have the dress herself. Now, this excites Margaret, but May refuses to allow this. She says it's Isobel's dress, but she leaves the room because she's in a rage. Now, giving this dress to Margaret, though, makes Isobel get the warm and fuzzies inside. She notes that the state of grace, the peace and security of it, meant more than any dress. Ah, bless. Now, Isobel helps Margaret into the dress, after which Margaret hugs her with gratitude. Now, May then appears at the doorway, demanding that Margaret take the dress off. Now, the girls confirm that Isobel let her have the dress, but this only causes May to go over to Margaret and tear the dress off her. Now, this makes Isobel rage. She screams, "Damn you," at her mother over and over again. But this creates a look of peace and relief on May's face, and she leaves the girls alone. That sadistic biatch. Now, Margaret holds her torn dress and she sobs, and Isobel tries to comfort her. She says it's only a dress, but Margaret tells her to shut up because she didn't want it anyway. That ungrateful slurry. That ungrateful person. Now, Isobel then allegorizes the dress as her state of grace, because both of them have now been destroyed, and she laments that such things were not for either of them.